Leadership has become incredibly complicated. Workplaces are being disrupted in ways we never could have imagined. So what's the biggest challenge to leadership? I'm Michelle Johnston, management professor, executive coach, and leadership expert. And I believe the biggest challenge for today's leader is connection. Why? Because research shows that connection drives results. That's why I've written the book, The Seismic Shift in Leadership, and why we are putting together this podcast series. Through interviews with some of today's top business leaders, we are going to explore how leaders' ability to connect with themselves, their teams, and their organizations defines their ultimate success or failure. Now, on to today's episode. Today we're going to be focusing on connection with yourself, specifically the importance of owning your story. And I can think of no better leader to speak on this subject than Kenneth Polite. Currently, Kenneth is the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Justice Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. Kenneth has an incredible story of growing up in the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. When his half-brother was killed by violent crime in 2004, he vowed he would do everything in his power to be a part of a solution. I got to know Kenneth when he was the U.S. Attorney here in New Orleans, where I live. Right from the start, you could tell that Kenneth was a totally different type of U.S. Attorney. He didn't lead first with power, which is typical of U.S. Attorneys' offices. He led instead with connection to his people and connection to his community. I know you will enjoy my discussion with Kenneth Polite. Passionate about what I have observed with the seismic shift, that command and control no longer works. We could have a huge debate of whether it ever worked, but it certainly was the norm and it certainly was in vogue. And we don't have resilience now as human beings to put up with any sort of abusive leadership or toxicity in the workplace. And so my entire thesis in my book, The Seismic Shift in Leadership, is that right now, to be successful as a leader, as a human, it's all about extraordinary connection. And so ordinary connection before was just transactional. It was much more just work focused, do this, do that, very directive. But what I've seen, the leaders who've lost their jobs subscribe to that old model. But the leaders like our guest today, Kenneth Polite, who get it and recognize the importance of extraordinary connection and really making time and making sure that it's intentional and deliberate to connect at a personal human level, those are the leaders that truly thrive. So welcome, Kenneth Polite, who is in a relatively new role in the Department of Justice, the Assistant Attorney of the Criminal Division, the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division.
That's correct. Since July of 2021, I've been in that role and making the trip down to D.C. throughout the week. And my family's been extraordinarily supportive of that process. It's been a lot of change for us.
Well, tell us, okay, so do you mind sharing with the listeners, because those who have already read my book, who've got advanced copies, the ones that they tell me about, they're like, Kenneth Polite, his story is amazing. Do you mind sharing real fast your story for the listeners? Because it begins with you and your connection with yourself.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. And again, thank you for everything you're doing in spotlighting this shift in the way we're embracing leadership now. As you said, my story, I'm from New Orleans, born and raised, born to teenage parents. My mother and father were in housing projects at the time that I was born. My mother ended up as a single mother fairly shortly after I was born. My folks divorced when I was about 4 or 5. And she ended up raising 3 boys by herself in the lower 9th Ward, which many of you may know is one of the poorer areas of the city of New Orleans. And despite our humble upbringings, my mom, in connection with my loved ones, managed to build just a tremendous wealth of community and support for us, particularly around our education. And Thanks to my mom's sacrifices throughout the years, I was able to get a fantastic education, first at De La Salle High School, where I graduated as the first African American valedictorian, and then on to Harvard and Georgetown, and on and on. And I've just been blessed to have some fantastic mentors along the way and some fantastic family members, including my wife, who I met on my very first day of school at Harvard, and has been, frankly, the rock that has helped our family through our own seismic shifts, personally and professionally, over the years.
Well said. So, how do you think that having that connection with yourself and really embracing, okay, this is my story, this is my narrative, this is who I am, and I think I pretty much need to own it in order to connect with others? That's what I have found. The leaders who've lost their jobs were trying to be somebody else. They were
Yeah.
uncomfortable in their own skin, hiding parts of themselves, thinking they had to be like this or like that. And then they lost connection with their team. It was over. But
Yeah.
you had a strong sense. You didn't hide pieces of yourself.
To be candid, I'm not sure if I always was so out in front related to my story, and I think that is one of the struggles of professional development and, frankly, leadership, particularly in a professional context. That I see the best leaders start to develop that sense of being genuine about who they are, bringing their full selves to the workplace. Not necessarily hiding parts of themselves. And frankly, it was the advice I got from a fantastic mentor in New Orleans, a guy by the name of Lloyd Dennis, who created the Silverback Society, which is a program that mentors young men in the city of New Orleans. And when I started to be on the path of becoming U.S. attorney, he asked me a little bit about myself, and I shared a little bit of the narrative that I just talked about, but in particular highlighted some of the connections I have to both law enforcement. My father's a police officer, 37-year veteran of New Orleans Police Department, and my brother is also a police officer in Houston. But I've also had individuals in my family who have been in prison, been incarcerated, and even have lost loved ones to street violence, including my own half brother. And Lloyd was the one who was very instrumental in encouraging me to be out in front and tell your story as much as possible. And frankly, doing that will help you connect not just to the people who will work with you or under you, but frankly to the communities that you're going to be serving, and that they will appreciate the fact that you are in fact a person who understands that building community trust, being part of the community, is the most important tool that we have, particularly in law enforcement, in terms of preserving public safety. So that's kind of where that came from, and since then it's been a hallmark of the way that I've approached the way that I deal with the workplace.
When you were the U.S. attorney in New Orleans, it really blew me away how you turned what always is a bastion of power, and so many U.S. attorneys, so many lawyers in particular lead with that power. It's all about power, right? And you came into the office and turned it upside down and said it's about connection. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
It still strikes me that concept, that model of being a prosecutor, is the way that people have traditionally both viewed and move forward and embrace the role. It is very much, let's bring the hammer. I think there's two things there. One, I came in as a U.S. attorney under then Attorney General Eric Holder, and one of his very first pieces of advice that he gave to me, and I know he advocated the same and shared it with other U.S. attorneys, was that our role was not to be prosecutors; it was to be community problem solvers, right? And so the idea of, your job's not to put people in prison; it's to figure out ways to use every tool at your disposal, whether it's in enforcement, which is critical, but also things like reentry or intervention or treatment, or most importantly, prevention and helping young people avoid the criminal justice system altogether. Those are all the types of tools that we need to bring to bear. And frankly, the idea of embracing just the power aspect of that job misses a lot of those tools that you can utilize. Look, everybody knows who the U.S. attorney is. We know who the assistant attorney general is for criminal division. We know who the attorney general is. Those are positions that we all know have a great deal of power within our society. I don't need to be out in front with that. That comes with the title and with the role. I think it's the other aspects that you can bring to bear in that role. Particularly, we talk about the ability to convene, right? I mean, if I call together a group of community leaders or business leaders or, nonprofit leaders and say, I want to meet with you, the call is usually answered. I'm usually able to connect people who we can't necessarily get in a room otherwise, but for the authority of using that power to convene that comes with that job, and making those connections not just through me, but to those parties that otherwise aren't able or aren't willing to talk to one another.
Gosh, if I had to guess, I don't remember that about Eric Holder. That is, he has to be an anomaly in the way that he set your expectation or his expectation for you. Do you think other attorney generals said that?
Well, I know for a fact that our current attorney general certainly feels that way as well. He is someone who is an alum of the criminal division, has spent a wholly separate career on the bench, and has seen, the role that enforcement and prosecution can play, but also its limitations. And certainly he is a person that views the use of all of those tools as being important in our role in preserving public safety. Loretta Lynch is another fantastic mentor of mine, and I had the pleasure of serving on her advisory committee during the time that she was the attorney general, and I know she very much embraced the same. I think part of what you get with people like Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch in particular, those are people who have been line prosecutors. They've been U.S. attorneys, so they've had to deal with community issues. They've also been defense attorneys as well, right? And they're also individuals who come from humble beginnings in a lot of respects as well. Eric is a New York boy. He talks about his own upbringing in the same way that I try to, obviously coming from a very different city, but those perspectives, that broad perspective, and bringing that to bear in these jobs, I think is a fundamental part of what we're talking about and being effective as a leader.
Absolutely. And it reminds me, I'll never forget reading, it was in the New York Times one Sunday a couple years ago. Linsky out of Columbia did research and he named it Your Whisper is a Shout. When you're in a leadership position, your whisper is a shout. Everything you do is amplified. And so again, I keep kind of going back to how you explained that you didn't go into the position, and then we'll get to your current position as U.S. attorney in New Orleans as thinking it as off from a power perspective, that it was your community problem solver. But that came from above, and that whisper was a shout. And it set the tone for how you would measure, how you felt that you would be measured as successful or not. And
Yeah.
so I want our listeners to understand how powerful that is, right?
It was so interesting that whisper is a shout idea, and really coming. I'm not sure if when I walked in day one, I fully appreciated the significance of what you just said. But it quickly became clear to me. I had the very first speech that I gave as U.S. attorney was to the Chamber of Commerce. And in the Chamber of Commerce speech, I talked about, what some of my initiatives were going to be. And then I at the very back half of it, I talked about, hey, I talked to a lot of business leaders, and a lot of them asked me, Kenneth, what can I do to help you? How can I help play a role in terms of preserving public safety? And I said, the answer is give people a job when they're coming out of prison. And so then I started talking about kind of models of reentry. And one of the things that ultimately led to is a partnership with the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Council of New Orleans, where we created a program, or modeled it after a program out of Michigan called 32-2, where we try to get 30 local businesses in New Orleans to commit to hiring 2 formerly incarcerated individuals for at least a 2-year period. And by the end of that, we had well over 30 businesses that had taken on that pledge, and we had placed almost 20 different individuals in jobs during that time. But it was one of these things where like the community reaction to that, like I wasn't prepared that this kind of part of a speech, which I knew was important to me, but it very quickly, I think, helped reshape the discussion within the larger New Orleans community around issues of public safety and particularly how reentry could play a role in improving it. I mean, look, New Orleans, as I used to say, is the epicenter of incarceration in the world, right? If you think about the United States having leading the world in terms of its incarceration rates, Louisiana at the time, and maybe back today, it kind of flip flops back and forth between Oklahoma sometimes, between leading the country, and then within the state of Louisiana, the parish of Orleans is the most heavily incarcerated, and so and those are 95% of those people in prison. They're going to come back into our communities. And so you have to be thoughtful. We need to be thinking about what are we doing to help those individuals become law-abiding, productive members of our community, as opposed to going back through the revolving door of recidivism.
Yes, incredible. And I love that that was your first speech and what an impact it made on the community and really was a call to action for businesses to get involved and connect. And so let's segue into your new role. Tell me, how are you connecting with your team? Tell me what you're doing. How is it?
Well, first of all, I'm blessed to have just an absolutely fantastic team. I'm not sure if people understand the criminal division is one of the largest components within Main Justice. We have individuals that deal with issues ranging from fraud, and that could involve things like healthcare fraud or Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, to computer crimes and intellectual properties, to human trafficking and alien smuggling, human rights violations, narcotics, organized crime, money laundering, all types of, we've got our own appellate section. And then we've got a whole nother section that deals with our international relations between the Department of Justice and our international partners. And it includes individuals that are involved in, processing requests for information. And when we're extraditing individuals back and forth between our countries, that all comes out of the criminal division. But we also have teams of people who help train and mentor prosecutors and law enforcement officers around the world. All of that's within the criminal division. Criminal division is over 1,200 individuals that I get a chance to work with on a day-to-day basis and serve as their representative to the public. And frankly, I've been just blown away by the capacity and the expertise that these individuals have. So start there with the team. I will tell you, and I'm sure you've heard this over and over again from many leaders, but COVID has just been a terribly difficult time period. This pandemic has made that issue around connections so much more difficult, particularly for someone like me who I just hate being glued to a desk. I would much rather be out walking the halls or out in the community, even better, or traveling and being able to connect with people. And it's just been dangerous for us to be able to do that. And so we've had to be as creative as possible in trying to come up with other ways to connect with the community, and in particular with our workforce. And I think we've been able to do some of that. I'll just jump in and tell you a little bit, because it's been so interesting as we've been able to talk about trying to be creative here. One of the things that I do is I do use video a lot more. We do a lot more recordings. And one of the things is I've basically created kind of my own talk show, Michelle, where I it's called United Division, and we get an opportunity to have a one-on-one fireside chat with one individual employee from within the criminal division, and we spend it ends up being about a 5 to 10 minute clip, and we talk about their lives and their professional experiences and what they do on behalf of the division, and it gives us a chance to spotlight the most experienced individuals who are revered within the department, people like Patty Stimler, who just stepped down as our long-serving appellate chief, to new individuals who are, new employees like Raven Gaddy, who has traveled the world and just was hired as my office manager very recently after a stint in the Peace Corps, right? And so like people are coming from all these varieties of backgrounds and able to share all of that. And, again, not even in the best of times when we were in our normal workflow, these were oftentimes components within the criminal division that were very much siloed. You would not get a chance to meet some of these individuals and get to know them personally like that. And so that's been very well received. The other thing that we've spent a lot of time on is, again, I mentioned those over 1,200 employees. I've spent at least 2 to 3 minutes talking to each and every one of them. It's been almost like a speed dating kind of a process where thanks to my section leaders and our unit chiefs, we've organized, group Zooms or team meetings, and we've gone through one-on-one, and I've gotten a chance to hear everything about different people, literally each and every one. And my team hated the idea because they were like, this is going to take so much time. By the end, they were like, it still took a lot of time, but it was very much worth it. And that has been very well received by our workforce, and frankly has been truly transformative to me to get to know some of the people who are doing work for us, again, throughout the country and around the globe. I mean, we've got individuals in countries like Brazil and Argentina, and we've got folks in Hong Kong, we've got folks staged at The Hague, we've got folks sitting in Ethiopia, getting to know all about what their work is and how their families are doing, and getting to know a little bit about them personally has just been fantastic. So
that is extraordinary connection. That is exactly what I'm talking about. It's going above and beyond right now because of what we're going through. And I really don't think we're going to go back. I think this hybrid environment is going to be the way. And you're right. And you've got to, as leaders, you've got to think creatively. How do I personally connect? Because it is so much more about now seeing you on the other side of this computer as a human. And asking about, a lot of leaders have been scared about asking personal questions. I don't want to know what's going on personally. Let's just accomplish our goals. And I keep saying, but you're not going to get the results you want unless you figure out how to meaningfully connect.
Yeah, well, so I'll tell you, look, my HR folks will tell me like, hey, there's certain questions that you can't ask, but if someone offers it, then maybe we can start having a conversation about those things. But I think the way that and this is the way that I try to approach that as much as possible and encourage folks to build an environment where sharing, again, all of themselves, as part of what they bring to the workplace, is I try to do the same. Right. So one of the most recent videos that I did was from my basement while I was in quarantine. I tested positive for COVID on Christmas Day, and I did this video just like talking about, hey, my family's got me trapped in my basement right now. That's where I'm recording from. I look like I'm dressed up. I have my button down and my jacket on, but trust me, I've got sweatpants on, and just like all of you, and just talked openly about the challenges that have come through COVID, myself testing positive, my little one. We've had, like everybody else, number of family members. I lost my grandfather to COVID in the earlier stages of the pandemic. And so, I've talked openly about that as well. And talked about, despite all of those challenges, we have people within this division who are doing extraordinary things. First of all, there's a lot of people who aren't able to be locked away in their homes. They're still having to travel around to try cases and appear in courts and interview witnesses and conduct the work on behalf of the public. And so thanking those people publicly, but two, recognizing that there are people who are doing just what I'm doing, which is trying to build connections in extraordinary ways that they weren't necessarily doing prior to the pandemic. So they're checking up on one another more frequently. They're, sending condolences when people are struggling with medical issues. They're sending food over to people's houses, right? I mean, and they're finding creative ways to celebrate the good things, the weddings, the births, and all those types of things as well. And that's the type of message that I wanted to make sure people appreciated. And again, I think it comes from being genuine and open as a leader. And then hopefully that encourages and fosters an environment where people feel the same.
Gosh, I'm just thinking that in the past, I don't know how many years ago, I would imagine somebody in your position who had been diagnosed and was quarantined in a basement might not even admit it, might pretend that everything is okay. This is talk show.
Well,
These are beliefs coming from like,
right.
because it would be a sign of weakness, right? But it's the ability to say, I am like you. I am stuck in the basement trying to figure this out. And that's what
Well, we had a president, FDR, who hid the fact that he was in a wheelchair for years, right? I mean, that was certainly viewed as a potential sign of weakness, and that was not. Those were different times, and we were in the middle of World War II, and showing that type of strength from the executive office was viewed as the appropriate way for him to portray leadership. Interesting enough, he was a leader who found very creative ways to make connections, though, despite some of those limitations. The whole idea of fireside chats really, that's him, right? That's that making that connection with the American people. And so I do find lessons from throughout history where people, even in times where this wasn't necessarily as embraced as a model of leadership, the best of leaders, like an FDR, almost 80 years ago, was still trying to find creative ways to connect with people.
I love how you just framed that, finding creative ways to connect with people. I was talking with the leader yesterday on a coaching call, and she was so funny. She's like, yeah, we've all been told we've got to begin meetings with on a scale of 1 to 10, how you doing, or personally, family, business. She goes, I just call it crappy happy. We begin with crappy happy. What have you done that's not so good, or what you experienced, and what's happy? And I thought, now that's a creative way of connecting. It adds levity.
That's right.
This is just
That's
a
right.
really hard time. But I have found that the leaders who've given me pushback, like Michelle, I have too much to accomplish on my agenda. I can't spend 15 minutes of a meeting going around doing happy crappy. I can't do it. And then I'll say, okay, what do you want to achieve? Well, I need these results. I said, you're not going to get the results unless you embed time to meaningfully connect. It's just the way of the world right now. I truly believe it. And the Great Resignation has taught us that, right? Is that employees had times to think, and not just employees, humans, and we all just want to be seen, heard, valued, appreciated. So leadership, I think right now is harder than it's ever been, because now you do have to think, how in the world am I going to connect so that my people, 1,200 of your people, feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. I've heard leaders talk about those kinds of meetings and kind of the opening. Let's have this open dialogue before we jump into work. And I think it's interesting. It's an interesting tie back to thinking about enforcement as like the only tool that we use. And again, the most effective leaders are the most creative ones, right? That's one way to try to build that type of connection with your people, but nothing is stopping you from picking up the phone and having a one-on-one conversation, right? Or shooting an email to somebody and just saying, hey, thinking about you. Hope all is well, right? I mean, I have folks who will reach out to me at times about a work issue, and the answer's got to be, I've got to be the person to approve it. And so that could be a one sentence statement in an email, but maybe at the end of it, I say, "Hey, by the way, how have you been?" And that starts up like an email string that we're talking over the day over email but it's one on one. And again, it goes to this point of figuring out how to empower people to again bring themselves to the workplace, but to your point, making sure people feel valued and seen and heard. And that can't be a situation where we're relying on one tool. You have to be as creative as possible in doing it, and using every opportunity that you have, especially right now.
Like a talk show. I mean, that's brilliant, Kenneth. How cool is that? And I love it that too. You said you got some pushback from your team when you said, I want to figure out how to connect with each and every one of my employees. And that ended up emerging from Boise Bollinger as one of the chapters in my book, that if you're going to be a successful leader, first, you have to listen. You have to go around and listen before you come in and just make abrupt changes. And that's exactly what you've done.
Yeah. Yeah, and Boise is like another just an amazingly thoughtful leader who I've gotten a chance to know during my time as U.S. attorney, especially just the success of his businesses over the years. He'll tell you, like, it's not. I rely on people. Like I rely on making the connections to people, and to tie it back to what we were talking about earlier on reentry, Boise has been one of the strongest supporters of hiring formerly incarcerated people in his workplace, and had been doing that and having success in doing so for years. Again, before it was, kind of the trend to talk about it, he was already doing that in that space because he saw the value in people. Despite the fact that they'd made mistakes and paid their debts to society, there was value in people.
He was ahead of his times for sure.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
In the shipyard industry, and going and listening to the front line and taking the supervisors out of the equation and saying, you need to be nicer to your people. I want to listen to them. You know who we just interviewed? Do you know Robert LeBlanc?
I don't.
Oh, he's great. He was actually my student at Loyola, and he owns a boutique hospitality firm in New Orleans. And I'm trying to think if have you ever eaten at Sylvain?
Of course, yes.
Okay, well, that's one of his.
That's one of his. Got it.
And he just opened up the Hotel Chloe recently.
Yes.
He's a younger leader, and what his big takeaway as far as is what best practice as far as meaningful connection right now. He said, I've learned that we have much more frequent meetings and in a reduced time. He said, so every single morning at 6:40, we get on the telephone with my leaders for 10 minutes every morning, because I don't want them up at night thinking, oh God, I have to send an email. They know that in the morning we're going to connect for 10 minutes. He said, and then the once a week meetings are shorter as well. He wants to embed more frequency and less time. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah, I think that's right. I will tell you, there's one really good book out there that called Death by Meeting, which talks a little bit about that. And the idea of having more effective meetings might mean you actually have more meetings, but they're maybe more frequent. They're shorter. They're more precise. They're more targeted in terms of addressing certain topics or issues. So that's one of the ones that I tend to hand out to my workforce team, my senior leadership team, and it's going to be on their shelves right next to Seismic Shift.
That's right. Right next to Seismic Shift and leadership.
Exactly.
I think you're onto something, because you had mentioned that you are trying to touch every person, whether it's a Zoom call or not, for 1.5 minutes.
Yes.
So it's reducing. I think we might be onto something, Kenneth. If we can roll this out, that it's just, you don't have to have a Zoom for an hour.
No.
People are losing their mind.
That's right. That's right.
15 minutes, just a quick connection.
Yeah. And we still have to figure out a way to connect in person. I mean, I'm not putting that completely to the side. And it's one of these things where I've learned, I've got a lot of fantastic young people who serve as front office assistants, many of whom, like Raven, have served in the Peace Corps and have been elementary school teachers, and they're at the earlier stages of their careers. And some of the most important lessons that I've learned about the division itself have come through them, right? They're fresh eyes who are coming in just like me, and they're saying, hey, this is working well, this is not working so well, these are things that you should think about improving. And those came through one-on-one lunches with them, like during my first couple of weeks on the job, right? So
face to face, actually breaking bread and have. Are you all back? Are you all in the office? So you say you go up to DC every week, so you're there.
So essentially, we have. We're still in max telework as a department. What that means is that my front office team is typically there 3 to 4 days a week. I'm typically working here from Philadelphia at least 1 to 2 days a week. So yeah, we've got some folks that are in the office. Some attorneys are in the office about the same frequency, but the overwhelming majority of folks are still, working from home most of the time. Again, we've got folks that are on the road though, and in courtrooms on a day-to-day basis on behalf of the public. bringing these cases to bear. So to those people, making sure that they're remaining safe while they're out there engaging with defense counsel and defendants and witnesses and judges and jurors, that becomes a real challenge for us to make sure that they're safe while they're still performing their very important public service.
Absolutely. So we'll wrap it up with what does success look like for Kenneth Polite as the head of the criminal division in your relatively new position? If we're going to talk in a couple years, what does success look like?
Yeah, so I think success for me means a couple of things, and just broadly speaking, you always hope that you leave the place better than you found it, right? And that you make some positive contribution to it. I think that a couple of the things that we are hoping to achieve include making the work of the criminal division more victim focused, and we're being very thoughtful about the types of cases that we bring, as well as the way that we engage with victims of some of the criminal investigations and prosecutions that we bring, and making sure that they have a voice there. That's going to be an increasingly more important part of the work that we do. And again, we're being very creative in how we do that. Some of in terms of topics, I would say that corporate enforcement, and particularly issues around healthcare fraud and its impact on the opioid epidemic that continues to ravage our country, that is going to continue to be a very important function for us. We've just heard some very devastating stories, Michelle, around how opioid addiction continues to cripple communities. And in particular, the sophistication of some of the schemes, right? The role of physicians, right? In terms of fueling that epidemic. We've even heard of something called sober home abuse, where individuals are basically being cycled in and out of rehab centers, being re-addicted while they're there, then coming back in, and they're just being shopped around through these rehab centers, and without ever breaking the cycle of addiction that's crippling them and their families. And so those types of offenses are going to be at the forefront of our work in the healthcare fraud unit. Cryptocurrency and cybersecurity for us is absolutely a vital part of our portfolio, increasingly high profile part of the work that we're doing. We have a new national cryptocurrency enforcement team, in fact, that's going to be focused on that. And then last but not least is flat out trying to figure out ways to address violent crime, which is over and again the message that we hear, whether I'm talking to somebody from New Orleans to Memphis to New York to Chicago to San Francisco. It is the forefront effort of all of our law enforcement partners right now, and the criminal division can play a vital role in that as well.
Yeah, it made me feel a little bit better with all the carjackings in New Orleans when I found out it's not just us.
No. Unfortunately, sadly, there is some solace received by knowing that it's a broader epidemic that we are seeing in the country. But again, what I'm seeing from state, local, and federal partners is that there's no siloing. What we have to do is come together and figure out ways to be more impactful in terms of the types of cases and investigations that we're bringing to bear, but also not leaving anything on the table and using every other resource that we have at our disposal to fight it as well. And so I know that that's something that, again, the criminal division is going to continue to lead forward in using all of those tools.
Thank you. Kenneth, I just kind of got, when I was thinking about how grateful I am that you're one of the leaders of the United States right now and helping us. And I just feel such comfort knowing that you're really taking care of us and these issues are at the forefront, and that you're doing it through extraordinary connection and really thinking about the victims and treating your people as humans and wanting them to bring their full selves to work. I mean, this is all the stuff that I am so passionate about, and you are the embodiment of connection. And I just can't thank you enough.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this narrative that you're putting forward. I know this is going to be impactful work for so many people in the workplace. Thank you so much, and all the best to you and your family. So good to see you.
I can't wait till we talk again. I'm going to invent something else just so that you and I can have another conversation, because you're amazing. Thank you, Kenneth. Have a beautiful day with your family.
You too.
Thank you for joining us on the Seismic Shift. And before you go, can I ask one favor of you? Do you mind sharing today's episode with a leader you know? The power of this conversation is found in your using it and sharing it to create real connection in your life. Lastly, I'd like to thank Loyola University New Orleans and the Terra Firma audio team for helping bring this content to life.